Welcome to Global Risk Community Chat. Today our guest is Keith Reed. I'm very happy to have you here today, Keith. Welcome.
Hi, good to see you. Good to be here.
Likewise. So before we get into our topic for today, can you briefly introduce yourself to our audience?
So I'm Keith Reed. I was formerly the Chief Compliance and Ethics Officer at British Telecom, BT in London. I subsequently set up on my own. And for the last 12 years, I've worked with a raft of household name companies, LRN, Conversant, OneTrust, and so on around compliance and ethics. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you so much for that super quick introduction. With that being said, let's quickly get into our topic then. What would you like to share with us today?
Okay, well, I've just written my first book. It's called The Unconventional Compliance Officer. I've just been told by my publisher it's selling really well, which is a surprise. So I'm really pleased about that. But being serious for a moment. So compliance officers around the world, regardless of geography, of sector, of industry and so on, broadly face similar challenges. And what this book tries to do is to say, look at these unconventional ways of dealing with those challenges. So as an example, every compliance officer in the world, I'd suggest, spends their time pushing. You push out training, you push out reminders, you push out escalations, you push out communications, you push out policies and so on. And what does that lead to? It leads to compliance fatigue and pushback. And so, for example, what the book talks about is various ways that you can turn that compliance push into employee pull. And that can really make a fundamental difference to how effective your program is. So one example of the tools that I use, for example, is to create a compliance passport. I don't know what happens in your organization, but when people do their training, normally perhaps they might print off a certificate, but then they'll throw it in their drawer. More likely, it will just be on the system and they won't touch it for another year or two until the training comes around again. But the compliance passport is something which is much more tangible, much more durable, and so on, of a certificate of their achievement. And it opens up a lot of other possibilities. So, for example, why not put some compliance stamps in there when they've achieved a particular objective or whatever? It opens up a raft of opportunities. Now, for me, the passport really, really fundamentally changed compliance performance. What I discovered was in organizations I've worked with and so on, not everybody's got a lot of qualifications. So the passport became important to them. And I used to hear people in the corridor say, I got my passport and so on. So they were genuinely pleased to have it and genuinely engaged. So that's one example of what's covered in the book. I mean, the other thing that I perhaps move on to quickly is to say most companies, most organizations have a hotline. And the challenge for most compliance officers is really getting people to use that hotline and not only use it, but use it more and so on. And I must go to event after event where hotline use and all that sort of thing is a topic that comes up all the time. So one of the things that I did and is in the book and is covered in detail in the book is about branding your hotline. Now, most organizations call their hotline Speak Up or that sort of terminology and so on. But what I did was branded it, and I branded the hotline Veronica. So Veronica was our virtual regulatory compliance assistant. I know somebody else who called it by another name and all those sort of things, but that's Veronica is an example of what you can use. But what it meant was that people were much happier about, we'll call Veronica, I'll ask Veronica, I'll email Veronica. I mean, Veronica was my team essentially, but what it did, it gave it a face. So suddenly what it did, it moved calling the hotline to a really big step to something that was much more acceptable, amenable, and so on. And people could understand it and so on. The book also covers a raft of other tools and techniques and so on. I mean, one of the things that I do a lot is talk to organizations about getting people to make calls to the hotline about canteen food. They make a report about canteen food, good, bad, or indifferent. But what it means is they understand the process and they've been through it. So later on, 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever, later on, when they go through it for real and they're making a report, a full report, a proper report, they're not so afraid of it and they don't get deterred so easily. that sort of approach. And there's a raft of tools and techniques in the book that you can use and so on, that I have to say, I would say make a big difference to the hotline's use in your organization. One of the questions I also ask in the book is really about, it's the simple question of how far would you go? Some of you on this call might well disagree with me, but I'd say that most compliance officers have a limited range of tools. It's training, it's communications, it's a limited range of things that you can do. But one of the things I said was, well, how far would you go? One of the things I did, for example, is I sent out a bottle-shaped box at Christmas to everybody in procurement. In that box, rather than the bottle of wine or whiskey or whatever they expected, was a copy of the code of conduct and the policy on bribery and corruption. I was never forgiven for it, but they never forgot it. And so what that did, that simple box, that simple policy document in the box and so on, did 20 times what you'd get from normal routine training and so on. And there are other examples in the book that say, how far would you go? And some of those I think will certainly make you laugh. The other thing finally in the book, there is something which is called the compliance shield. And it came about because I had a conversation with people to say, what protects us from the law? What keeps us out of the courts and so on? And this exercise is really powerful, really simple, really powerful. And one of the things I speak at a lot of sessions on it and so on, and I end up saying to a lot of people, that's really good. You're really good at the things that don't matter. And you see the shock on their face and so on. But a lot of people have fed back to me afterwards. They've taken it away, and it is a really powerful and useful tool that only takes literally minutes. So I'm going to stop there. I think I'm nearly out of time, but I'm gonna stop there. I hope that's been useful.
Yeah, no worries at all. So first of all, congratulations on your first book. I hope that it also reaches more people. So, and thank you for also sharing some key things from it. I just have one last question that I want to ask before we end it, and that would be, what would be some takeaway points that you can give to people, regardless of if they read the book or planning to read or not planning to read? What would be the biggest takeaway you can share with the compliance officers, for example, listening?
I'd say really two parts to that. I'd say, first of all, be unconventional in your approach. It's easy said, but be unconventional and so on. And that's really the theme that I've tried to talk about this afternoon. Specifics, you might say, well, be specific. Okay, let me ask you, take away, what's your cost of compliance? If you know what your cost of compliance is per employee, I can tell you that we used to spend 10 to 12 pounds per employee per annum on compliance, but that became a really powerful tool. If you know your figure, you can leverage that hugely. But in all my travels around the world speaking about compliance, I've only encountered one other person who knew what they spent per employee per annum on compliance. But if you can find the figure, I'd certainly be interested in it. If you can work it out, because it's a really powerful measure.
Thank you for sharing that as well. It's also an interesting topic. I also don't really hear many people talk about, per employee compliance cost. So that's something I think people should be definitely looking at. And with that being said, as you said, also, unfortunately, we have run out of our time. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today, sharing insights from yourself, from your book as well. And yeah, I hope our audience also enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Have a lovely day.
Cheers.